Robert Frost is one of America's most renowned and admired poets. With a large repertoire of over 100 different poems, he is an exemplary example of a literary master. Many of his works focus on the beauty of nature, the importance of choice, and relationships. Most importantly, Frost often brings to light the inmost emotion of humans, exposing the struggles and triumphs of the ordinary man in a skillful way. One such example of this is the poem After Apple Picking, which I will be analyzing today. The main theme of After Apple Picking is the consequences of human action, and these consequences are the negativity of lack of achievement, loss of reality, and lack of ambition. So first of all, for loss of reality, throughout the poem, Frost shows the juxtaposition between consciousness and unconsciousness. The narrator, because of his actions, because of his overworked hours lead to a long and unfruitful harvest. And because of that, he slowly begins to lose his grip on reality. He loses hope, and he slowly starts to sink into despair. This can be seen through the use of enjambment throughout the poem, such as in lines 4 to 5 and lines 10 to 11. The sentences are incomplete at the end of one line, and they carry on to the next line, which shows the smooth transition between reality and unconsciousness, and how you might not even realize that you're slipping from the real world into the dream world. Frost also uses olfactory imagery in line 8 when he says, "The scent of apples I am drowsing off." This highlights how the consequences of the narrator's actions of apple picking have caused him to become sick of the smell of apples. And the smell of apples makes him more and more drowsy until he slowly starts to fade. Then in the next line, Frost continues this imagery of slipping from reality, and he uses alliteration and says, "I cannot shake the shimmer from my sight." And the use of repeated S's emphasizes the sound that people make when they're lulling someone to sleep, and it shows how the narrator himself is sinking into sleep. Speaking of which, the word sleep is repeated 6 times throughout the poem, which shows how it's one of the major themes, and how the consequences of overworking yourself leads to wanting to do nothing but leave the reality of the physical world and enter into sleep, because sleep is the only place where you have no burdens, it's the only place where there's no stress, and it's the only place where you don't have to worry about not meeting goals that you have. Then Frost uses visual imagery in lines 10 through 13 when he says, "I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the water trough and held against the world of hoary grass." So that pane of glass is ice, and when he holds the ice up to his eye, the world that he sees immediately becomes distorted, and it's not actually reality. And so when he picks up that glass, it shows that he himself is choosing to exit from reality into a world that's distorted, into a world that's not reality. And it shows how all he wants to do is leave the world that he's in because he's exhausted, because he's overtired. The next sub-theme is the negativity of the lack of achievement that comes from consequences of human action. So After Apple Picking shows that sometimes the things that you work the hardest towards are actually unachievable. And the very first 2 lines show this, where it says, "My long 2-pointed ladder sticking through a tree toward heaven still." And that 2-pointed ladder is an allusion to Jacob's ladder to heaven in the Bible, where Jacob attempted to build a ladder going all the way up to heaven, but he never quite gets there. Likewise, the narrator has a ladder, and it reaches toward heaven and towards these goals of contentment or perfection or enjoyment, but the narrator never quite gets there, and he's always climbing up the rungs towards something that he can't achieve, toward a goal that he can't reach. Later on in the poem, Frost continues this kind of unattainability when he uses visual imagery to describe the apples of the narrator's harvest. And he says that if the apples fall, all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap, as of no worth. And so this means that the apples, even though they seemed to be unblemished, had a hidden flaw on the inside that caused them to be discarded to the rotten pile to be turned into cider, which shows how even though people may be seemingly perfect on the outside, if there's something wrong on the inside, they will never achieve their high results or their goals in life. Then Frost shows the consequences of human action by highlighting that when you try too hard for something, it leads to lack of ambition. And this can be seen in lines 26 through 27, where it says, "For I have had too much of apple picking. I am overtired." And so obviously, this is a huge deal to the reader. It's ironic because at the beginning of the story, you can tell that he put so much effort into his harvest. He talks about having thousands and thousands of fruit to touch, how there's apples everywhere. Apples are basically the main part of his life. And it's it's ironic that he eventually wants nothing to do with the apples, even though they have everything to do with his life. And you can tell that the apples used to be a large part of his life in line 18, when he's describing his dream, and he says magnified apples. And the apples are magnified because they show how important they are to him. They're such a large part of the narrator's life, and they really are the central tenet of all that he holds valuable. And so it's a stark contrast at the end of the poem when he says that he's overtired of those apples, and it shows that his overworking has led to lack of ambition. So overall, Frost demonstrates that when the consequences of human action, that when you work too hard for something, it can often lead to lack of achievement because you're striving for something that you can never quite gain. It causes loss of reality because you're constantly working so hard for something that you eventually begin to lose focus and you begin to slip into sort of a dreamland. And it leads to lack of ambition because you eventually grow so overtired of things that you're exposed to day after day that you never want to see those things again.